Become a sustaining member of the Commonwealth Club for just $10 a month. Join today.
Welcome to the Commonwealth Club. I'm George Hammond, Chair of the Humanities Forum, which organized today's event. I'd like to welcome our authors today, Michael Heller and Jim Salzman. And they've written a book called Mine, and you won't believe how entertaining they made property law. I'm extremely impressed. I've taken property law myself. So many issues have been influenced by the way we make these decisions. And what's very interesting is we really do get to set the rules ourselves. And although it seems like we haven't done it because most of these things are just ancient habits in a way, but we did make it all up. And you both make really good arguments for how we can adjust the dimmer, as you called it, between the two extremes. So we'll start with this Garden of Eden reference that you had. I thought that was really great. You know, you had God saying about the tree of knowledge, it's mine. So you want to explain that?
Sure. So, and actually, let me, the Garden of Eden story is really premised on ownership, even though we don't think about it that way, right? So, imagine the scene, right? God basically says to Adam and Eve, welcome, make yourself at home, act like you own the place. Anything's yours, except you see that tree over there? See that fruit? Don't touch it. It's mine, right? And what do? They pluck the fruit. And at that point, it's not just ownership because it's theft. It's ownership because it's trespassing, right? What happens immediately after that is essentially they're evicted. And the Archangel Michael is put there with a flaming sword saying, I'm not just going to change the locks. Don't come back. I'm going to have Archangel Michael here. The thing that's interesting, though, also is if you think about the other great creation myth of Western civilization, and that's Prometheus. Right, the origin of Greek civilization. It's the same ownership story, right? He is taking something that's not his. He steals fire from the gods and gives it to people. And neither creation myth makes any sense unless you think about ownership.
So Archangel Michael, did you allow Jim to put this in? Because basically you're comparing God to a 2-year-old saying, it's mine.
Well, it is amazing that that 2-year-olds use these same simple stories that you see in the Bible and you see in Greek mythology. And it's the same simple stories that you see with, all through our daily lives today, as we, walk down the street, as we engage with businesses and governments. It turns out that in every culture in the world, for all of history, there's just this very small handful of simple stories that everyone uses to claim everything, from the Garden of Eden to the reclining wedge on an airplane seat.
So we won't talk too much about the other favorite word of 2-year-olds, which is no. we're trying to get everybody to agree on something here. So we'll talk all about 2-year-olds and mine. So who would like to describe the 6 different stories that we tell? Go ahead, Jim.
So let me give you actually an example from the playground. So we were talking a minute ago about kids saying mine. It's actually one of the first words that kids learn. And it's true in every culture. That's one of the first words. Noah's up there. Ball turns out to be really important in almost every culture. Mama, papa. But mine is right up there in that list. So I took my kids when they were small to the playground, and there was a fight that I remember that actually helped spark this book, which is my daughter and son fighting over a little red shovel. My daughter said, it's mine. I had it first. My son said, no, it's mine. I'm holding on to it. That's 2 of the 6 stories you're asking about. I'm holding on to it as possession, is 9/10 of the law. I had it first. It's first come, first served. I worked for it. That's a 3rd one. Labor. You reap what you sow. 4th one is it's attached to something mine. When you press that little button on the airplane seat and lean back, you say that space is mine because it's attached to my seat. So it's first, possession, labor, I worked for it, attachment. Self-ownership. It's mine because it comes from my body. It's my DNA. It's my genetic material. It's my clickstream online. And the last one, number 6, is family. It's mine because I'm in the family.
Well, I thought it was, we're going to jump around a little bit, not just go chapter by chapter, because I thought it was fascinating, the whole issue of making this part of your body stuff your ownership. And you have 2 great stories about human beings whose bodies created billions of dollars of wealth in medicine, and really didn't get anything for it. It wasn't their property anymore. So, and there's legal issues around that, and there's also the practical ones. So
Sure, I can take that. So many of the folks who are watching this will be familiar with Rebecca Skloot's fabulous book, The Immortal Life of Henrietta Lacks. And that's basically about how her cell line basically was used by researchers at Johns Hopkins to develop all kinds of medical advances. We talk a little bit about that. We spend most of our time in the book talking about the case of this guy called Moore, who was a patient at UCLA. And the doctor basically, when he was treating him for a form of cancer, he realized that Moore had the cell line that basically overproduced a particular substance that was valuable. But the doctor didn't tell Moore this. And he had him basically keep coming to UCLA for years for treatment. And Moore got a little suspicious one time. First of all, he was being put up in very nice hotels. And that was a tip-off. But also he had him sign this form, basically sort of giving everything away. And Moore just thought that was weird if he's coming down for a treatment. And so he basically looks into it. And it turns out that the doctor had been paid a lot of money and stood to make much more because he basically had taken Moore's cell line and was using it to produce these valuable substances. And so the case went all the way up to the California Supreme Court. And it's a classic example of these sort of competing stories that Michael was talking about, right? So Moore basically says self-ownership. It's my cell line. How can I possibly not own that? I mean, how is that even conceivable? And the doctor in UCLA in this case basically said, look, you abandoned it. Once it's outside your body, it's just like garbage on the street. And think of all the effort it took from the doctor to realize it was important and to isolate the cell line. So we've got self-ownership versus labor. Goes up to the California Supreme Court, and the UCLA lawyers essentially persuade the court that if you're going to have advances in medical research, you cannot have self-ownership for these cell lines, because they say you're going to do individual negotiations and, research will shut down. And the judges are persuaded. In the book, we criticize that. Michael, if you want to take over there.
Well, these issues come up. It's not just those sort of strange and random surgeries where it happens that you have $1 billion spleen that happened with Moore. So think about today, if you swab your cheek to send in a genetic sample to 23andMe, which a lot of us have done. It turns out the reason it's so cheap to do that swab is because you're not actually the consumer in that transaction. It feels like you are, but you're actually the product. What 23andMe is doing is they are assembling all those genetic samples into one huge database. They're also using the labor story. They're saying our labor in assembling that database is what's creating the value. And you're saying, well, no, it comes from my body. It's self-ownership. So it's the same conflicting story. It's maybe not quite as the stakes aren't $1 billion, but for your own personal data, the stakes feel pretty high. The most intimate data about your life, about your longevity, disposition to diseases, is all being sold to insurance companies to set rates, to pharmaceutical companies to develop drugs. And most people don't even realize that they're in the middle of an ownership battle when they swab their cheek. So anytime a new resource exists, like genetic data, there's a mad rush, and there's a wild west very much right now in genetic data. And every one of us is part of that. Even if you don't send in a sample, most of us can be individually identified today by samples that somebody else in our family has sent in.
And this is fairly similar to the question about all the personal data about, now everyone who's watching the show, there's that data is there. Everyone knows that the people who watch the show must have some interest in legal issues, et cetera, and all that is compiled. And that's just another area of it. And there's voting. There's so many different things that the information is out there and people are compiling it and using it for big data. What's the kind of legal ownership property issue when it's compiled and it loses its individuality and becomes just this, they say, we won't use your individual part. I mean, obviously on the computers they do, but.
Well, when I go and buy a ticket to fly to Chicago for the weekend, I haven't done that in a year, but when I used to, for the next week or two afterwards, I get the ads all around the internet saying, go to this hotel, stay at this restaurant in Chicago. So the tech companies are tracking everywhere you go online. That's called your clickstream. It's your record of your likes and looks. And it's actually far more detailed than just what you click on. They look at how long you hover there. And they also can cross-reference that more and more with other kinds of records, your Fitbit record, your location data from your cell phone. The level of detail would absolutely stagger you if you knew how much information was individually compiled and known about you as you move around online. They know that when you're going to get sick often. before you do from searches that you make. It's actually quite remarkable, the ability to track disease prospectively. So all of that data is very much up for grabs, just like genetic data. And we don't know today who owns it. So we talk about this often in terms of privacy. Privacy is being invaded. And in some places in the European Union, and actually in California, where many of your members are, California has a recent data privacy law that lets you opt out of some of this tracking. But what it doesn't let you do is say, I want to opt in if you pay me. Lets you say no, but it doesn't let you say yes if you feel like it's beneficial to you to be part of part of that system and get paid for it. So that option doesn't really exist.
And you think it should?
Absolutely. One of the things about ownership is that it's always a design choice. It feels like it's just natural. You click around and, it's the price you pay for using the internet. But it's absolutely not the case. It's a choice. It's an engineering choice about how we design the society that we want to live in and what we value. And if we don't put a price on it, if it seems to be free, you really have to always wonder, like, well, who actually is taking control of that data? And it turns out to be an unbelievably detailed dossier on each of us that gets marketed for different kinds of advertising purposes.
And George, one of the points that Michael's making is one of the key messages of the book, which is ownership is always up for grabs. Even when there are rules, those rules can be contested, but particularly the examples we've talked about so far, right? Your clickstream, for example, your cell line outside the body until those decisions. When there is the technology creates value in a resource, it becomes basically scarce and valued. People want it, and we assume that there are rules for that. You said, well, who owns it? It turns out we don't know, right? There's a battle going on, and because it's uncertain, this is a strategy we talk about called strategic ambiguity, right? When ownership is uncertain, those who know enough basically take it, whether it's actually theirs or not, and we don't know enough to say, wait a minute, it's mine.
You told a lot of stories of this intentional strategic ambiguity that the stores use, like why Apple stores are the way they are. Why don't you tell about that? Why do they have this open floor plan and invite everybody in and all that kind of stuff? It's very interesting.
So there's some very famous psychology experiments done about, I guess, 30 years ago now by Hahnemann and Thaler. And the setup was, there are two groups, right? One group is given a generic mug or candy bar or whatever. The famous experiment was with a mug, but there have been hundreds of experiments done since then. One group is given the mug. Another group is shown the mug. And the group that's given the mug essentially is asked, how much would you have to be paid to part with the mug? What's its value? The other group is asked the same question. What's the value of this mug? You would think both groups would say it's identical, right? It's just this generic mug. And yet, the group that was given the mug values it twice as much, if not more, right? And they call this the endowment effect. And the finding, and again, it's been reproduced in all kinds of different situations, is that once you physically possess something, its value to you goes up because it's this sense of loss, right? I'm not just giving up a generic coffee mug, it's my mug. So Apple takes advantage of this. The sort of random chaos that you see in Apple stores actually is intended to give the customers plenty of time to play with the cool gadgets. And over time, this iPad starts to feel like my iPad, and the crazy high price doesn't seem so crazy high. But it's not just Apple, right? Think about the efforts that car dealers make to get you to do a test drive or to try on clothes in a store, or the try it out, and if you don't like it, you can return it. All of those are intended to trigger our endowment effects so that the actual value of the good goes up in our minds.
Well, we saw this future coming when Clarence Thomas was up for the Supreme Court because they pulled out his records of which movies he had rented from the video store. And I mean, that was one thing. But if you think about it from what you were saying earlier, Michael, with credit card records, and most people buy their food at the grocery store with that, the health insurance places would have a pretty good idea about how you eat and how well you eat, what you eat, if that was compiled in some way for them, among many other details that they have.
Yeah, so your location data, what you eat, how you exercise, and then the power really comes from integrating these databases and then identifying who wants to sell you what. It's really quite a surprising change. Moving from part of what's so powerful about this is our brains evolved in thinking about possession. One of the stories we've been talking about in a very physical, tangible world. So it also all traces back to animal territoriality, then becomes the human notion of possession. All those instincts that are so powerful that sort of drive us through our day don't actually translate very well into our online lives. We still bring with us those animal instincts. But it turns out that it's possible to adjust what ownership means online in ways that people haven't really caught up with. You have to have some simple heuristics, some simple devices for thinking about what ownership means. You sort of think of it as an on-off switch. I possess it or I don't. So that managed chaos in the Apple Store is triggering that possession instinct, but it's also the little online shopping cart in Amazon, or the buy now button is also triggering that possession instinct. And it turns out that online, that buy now button doesn't mean what people think it means.
It's interesting that with this much information, it seems like it's going to put a big crimp on crime, actually, because they're going to know who the possible criminals are they have to have been there.
Well, if you remember the Minority Report, where there's precognition, where they sort of think ahead to what, with Tom Cruise, what crime is going to be. Here's the thing, even in the Minority Report, even in the Tom Cruise movie, there's still crime. Like, criminals are actually pretty creative. We're very creative about ownership, and criminals, it turns out, are very creative about acquiring ownership. This goes back to our Adam and Eve story, and I guarantee it will be true in the future as well.
I think that's a reliable thing. We can bet on that. So how about your ownership? There's a term, let's see, ownership gridlock. Do you have ownership rights to the term ownership gridlock?
If someone paid me a nickel for every time that term got used, I wouldn't, I would still be here. I love doing this. But I'd have a nicer summer house. So actually ownership, let me explain what's ownership gridlock. About 25 years ago, I discovered a phenomenon about ownership that hadn't previously been noticed. So we're all familiar, like, if there's too few ownership rights, if anybody can put pollution into the air, we get too much pollution. If anybody can take fish out of the water, we get too much overfishing, fish go extinct. So too few property rights in a commons and a shared resource lead to overuse and destruction of the resource. That's called the tragedy of the commons. And what I discovered is there's an exactly equal and opposite, but not previously noticed phenomenon, which is a tragedy of the anti-commons. Too many owners can lead to very costly underuse of scarce resources. So let me give you one very concrete example. It used to be that when scientists did very basic medical research, the way they got rewarded was to have their reputation went up. They might get a prize. They would get published something. They would get tenure. But all that basic knowledge about how the body works was available for the public. They published that. Starting around 1980 in America, we shifted the ability to own very basic knowledge about science, what's called upstream knowledge, the knowledge about basic medical discoveries and devices and methods. So we got many, many patents. That was the start of the biotech revolution. But that large increase in patents, that large increase in ownership actually led to fewer drugs that actually treat disease ending up in bottles, fewer pills that save lives. Why? Because the companies that actually put pills in bottles now, instead of having all the basic research that they needed available from university laboratories, now each of those separate pieces was separately owned by some patent owner. It's like trying to get from one town to another on a river, and there's different different toll booths all the way down the river, and each one is operated by a separate company, in this case, a separate patent holder. The negotiations became impossible, and more property rights paradoxically led to less life-saving innovation. That's ownership gridlock, and it turns out to be a phenomenon that is very widespread among a modern high-tech economy, where most of how we innovate is around assembling pieces of patents into a new invention, or pieces of copyright into a documentary, so it turns out that today, at the frontier of innovation, we have a lot more blockage from having too many property rights rather than from having too few.
Sort of like the other extreme from piracy. When you were saying that, I was thinking of the Rhine River or the Mediterranean when the pirates ran it. I mean, it essentially, or along the Silk Road, if there's too many pirates, nobody trades along the route anymore.
And too many patent owners has the same exact function as too many pirates, because each one gets to have their ransom along the path to drug development or to rap music. Actually, the same thing happened to rap music, changed radically because of copyright gridlock. Documentary films have been affected. A lot of our culture has been lost to gridlock because of too much copyright protection as opposed to too much patent protection.
That's a very good example you say there's always these two extremes in property, right? And you're always arguing that somewhere, you set the dimmer somewhere in between those two things and it works out better.
That's one of the things we really try to get across to people is that our intuition, the way our sort of animal instincts about property is this, it's either mine or it's not mine. Right. And if you're a bear, that's actually really valuable to know. Is this my territory or am I going to get eaten? And that's actually, we still think about ownership that way. It's like a light switch. It's turned on or off. But in the modern economy, thinking of it like a dimmer, where you want to set it at just the right amount. I'd like to go back to our earlier story to protect John Moore and his bodily integrity, and to protect the scientists at UCLA who are trying to develop a drug. How do you set property rights so both of them can get rewarded instead of one or the other? And that dimmer switch is actually a very powerful image for thinking about ownership today.
Yeah, I thought it was a great image. And Jim, you did some work on the New York City watershed, right? Yeah. And use this idea. So I thought that was fascinating. I mean, I didn't realize that they had to do that in order to keep the water tasting good, but it's so applicable to so many climate things now. So why don't you tell the story about that?
Sure. So those of you who travel to New York City realize that New Yorkers are not a humble bunch. The greatest theater, the greatest buildings, the greatest, you name it. One of the things they say is the greatest is their tap water. And as someone who grew up in Boston, it pains me to say this, but they're right. The New York City tap water is the best in the country. They routinely win blind taste tests against bottled water. So why is that? Well, for one thing, it's because the water is not from New York City. Right, the water comes from about 100 miles away in the Catskills and Delaware watershed. And it's been like that for over a century. But there was a problem. In the late 1980s, the water started getting polluted and degraded. And the reason is that there was increasing development and land pressures in those watersheds. And so New York basically planned to build a multi-billion-dollar treatment plant to treat the water. New York, the water basically is untreated. They take it from the Catskills and Delaware, a little chlorine filtered to keep out the dead bodies, but that's about it. Then it just goes into the taps. And they were set to spend billions of dollars on this plant. And so a guy called Al Appleton, who was the head of water for New York, this official, basically said, wait a minute. And he basically thought about this in terms of ownership. And what he realized was landowners provide a lot of benefits coming from their land that we benefit from. So think of someone who owns a wetland, right? So the wetland basically provides habitat for fish and for birds. It purifies water as it goes through. It provides a buffer against flooding. But the person who owns the wetland actually can't get rewarded for any of those benefits, right? They're all sort of public. And so don't be surprised that wetlands have low real estate value and they get paved over and drained. And so what Al basically said is he worked off this attachment notion that we talked about earlier. It's mine because it's attached to something I own. And he basically used what we call as if ownership. So he basically went to the landowners in the watershed and he said, look, let's act as if you own these benefits. You're purifying the water for us. We'd like to pay you for that. All right, so we're going to act as if you own the benefits coming from your land. And so they raised a bond, a green bond of $600 million. And they basically paid the landowners for this. And the EPA has waived the requirement to build a treatment plant now for almost 30 years. And it's a wonderful example of investing in green infrastructure instead of gray infrastructure for purely financial terms. And it's all because of ownership engineering. It's because Appleton had the insight to realize that if you shift how things can be owned, practically speaking, you're going to change the behavior of the landowners.
I thought it was interesting in your book that China is actually doing some things. You advise people and governments on this around the world and how to use it. And when we think of China, we don't think of them as advanced when it comes to trying to stop pollution. But that's just a popular notion, and they actually do work on a lot of those areas because I've done it myself. But your story was very interesting. Yeah. So
if we thought that, we'd be wrong. Now, I want to be clear. China's got enormous pollution problems.
Right.
But they basically started focusing on that. And actually, this morning, literally, I was sending in a report. I'm working for the Asian Development Bank. on this issue right now for China. And the issue they're facing is they've had terrible flooding in past years. They're trying to encourage landowners to basically prevent erosion by putting in trees and vegetation. And they basically are saying for the landowners, we're going to pay you for the service of erosion control and flood protection. And we're going to act as though you own this benefit that you're providing us. And the strategy is called Payments for Ecosystem Services. And you find it now all over the world. I did a paper for Nature a few years ago that found there are over 500 programs around the world that take this approach, and over $50 billion change hands every year. And the irony of this is that, and we can talk about other examples later, but the irony is, in order to protect the environment, arguably there's too little ownership, and we need more ownership. So if I can just pivot to climate change, because it sort of fits in from this. So one of the big challenges to climate change is deforestation, right? Both because trees suck in carbon dioxide, and when you burn trees, they release carbon dioxide. So losing forests is a double whammy in terms of climate change. And so the challenge is, how do you make trees worth more standing than cut down? And one of the strategies is to do the same thing Al Appleton did in New York City, same thing that the Chinese are doing, and that is to basically go to the landholders in the states in the Amazon and to say, we're going to treat you as if you owned the carbon that your plants are sucking in. And the more you can do that, the greater you reduce deforestation, we'll pay you more. And that's it. The strategy is called REDD, Reduced Emissions from Deforestation and Land Degradation. And it really is one of the cutting edge instruments right now being used to battle climate change. And it's all premised on this idea of as if ownership.
Is it made much progress? Because everyone's talking about how much of the Amazon disappears on a yearly basis. Is it slowing it down? I understand it hasn't reversed it at all. It certainly has not reversed it, right? Deforestation is a very complicated phenomenon. I think it has slowed it down. There are questions, though, about that are more complicated about REDD in terms of who's going to pay for this, right? Yeah. So these are benefits that we all benefit from, but if you get something for free, it's kind of hard to pony up for it, right? And so to date, it mostly has been Norway. Norway, I was going to say, you mentioned Norway, yeah. Yeah, that's been paying for this. That's right. Michael, there's another big land issue that you cover in the book about farms that are owned by families, small owned farms, and what's that's happened over the years, and how people have lost their farms. We've heard about I grew up in the Midwest, heard how family farms are lost, but you had a very interesting example of all that. Right. Well, we've talked about a number of our different basic ownership stories: first in time, possession, attachment, our bodies, self-ownership. The one you're raising now is about family ownership. And it turns out that in America, we actually have two quite different systems for how ownership gets passed on from generation to generation. So there's one system, which we maybe can talk about later, for super rich people, not for the 1%ers, but for the 1% of the 1%ers. States like South Dakota have become the world's leading money haven. They actually crush Switzerland and Cayman Islands. If you're super rich, you already know this. But that's a system for the super rich. For the rest of us, there's a different and much harsher system. And the harshness of it becomes really apparent for very poor people. So the story that you're asking about has to do with African-American land ownership in this country. One of the really great benefits of one of the first and most tangible benefits for freed slaves was the ability in America for the first time really to own land. So after the Civil War, that became like the driving force for many African-American families. From 1870 till 1920, 1 million African-American families became landowners, mostly in the American South. Since then, in the last 100 years, exactly, African-American land ownership in this country has dropped by 98%. 98%. And it's, partially for reasons that would not surprise you, which is, a lot of racist violence and discrimination that African-American families suffered in the South, trying to hold on to their land. But that's only really a part of the story. A lot of the story is driven by these hidden workings of the American system of ownership. So typically Black farmers were worried about writing wills. The local lawyer was usually a white lawyer. They didn't trust them for good reason. So they died without a will. And in America, if you die without a will, your property is split among your heirs, usually mostly your children. So in one generation, there might be a few kids, in two more, in three more. It grows exponentially. So over a handful of generations, you would have dozens or hundreds
of owners of a single family farm. And if any of you have tried to like manage anything with more than a few people, it's very hard to do, you know.
I have 12 children, so you don't have to tell me about that.
So you're very familiar with this problem. You're very familiar. You know, if you have a summer house that that you're trying to manage with your siblings, maybe you and your siblings can do it, but the grandkids can't. So that splitting of ownership is very hard to manage. And one of the features of it is that any one of those fractional owners, any one of those heirs, with a 1/100th share, they can force a sale of the family farm as a whole. They can do what's called partitioning, separating that joint ownership, we all own the farm together, into separate pieces. And the way that actually happens in the American South is that usually that white lawyer who didn't write the will goes and finds one of those heirs. They're often people who've moved away, migrated to Chicago, and buys that small fractional share for basically nothing, $100. Goes back down to that county in Mississippi or Georgia, and then forces a sale of the farm as a whole. It's a cash sale on the courthouse steps, and that lawyer ends up with the farm for a very low ball price. The family can't organize. There's 100 of them, and they have to pay cash on the day of the auction. So they can't even bid usually on the sales. And that mechanism, that sort of very harsh American law in the American South, it's true everywhere, but the playing out of it has been in the South, has led to the most staggering wealth destruction for African Americans over the last century. You sort of wonder about racial wealth gaps. This is actually a big piece of it. It's not just the racist discrimination and violence. It's also the hidden workings of the American law of ownership, where the poorest people are given the harshest scheme that we have for ownership. And this can be fixed. Actually, there's a bill in Congress right now, just introduced in this session by Cory Booker, that's meant to address precisely this issue, heirs property where it's split among heirs, to create a mechanism where a family, if they do want to stay on the land, they can bid. If they don't have the cash, they can raise the cash over a period of time, so they can actually bid equally with the white lawyers who are trying to kick them off their land.
You also talked about maybe have some kind of rule about the fair market value being involved rather than these courtroom.
Yeah. So, if you buy and sell a house, you use a real estate agent who's going to buy and sell it for you. And their job is to get you a good price. And the way they get you a good price is to have an unhurried sale where you find just the right buyer for your house. If you had to sell it on a particular day on the courthouse steps for a cash only sale, like you see for foreclosure auctions on houses after the financial crisis and still today, those prices are typically much different and much lower. They're technically fair market value. There was an auction, but the number is really painfully low. It's a major mechanism for destroying wealth, particularly for African American families in this country.
I thought it was very fascinating because it showed that there was a totally different element involved, a legal element to the destruction of the wealth. And it wasn't, that they weren't taking care of the land or anything like that. It was just that the ownership kept being split down. You had a different story for Native Americans. We have, everybody has an idea from movies and everything that the Native Americans had a totally different idea about what property. They didn't think that they owned the land and all that kind of stuff. But the big problem was not that difference, but the land rules that were put in place for them, sort of to protect them, at least theoretically. So,
you have to put the word "protect" in quotation marks.
Yeah.
So when the federal government mostly forced Native tribes onto reservations in the 1800s, there was a push in the late 1800s to basically force assimilation of Native peoples into the dominant white culture. And one of the ways they thought to do that, they felt that if land was owned collectively, people would have the wrong relationship to land. And the solution was to have individual private property. And they felt that would be a major pathway for basically ending Native culture. They also prohibited teaching of Native languages, but the privatization of that land, of reservations, breaking up reservations into small separate farms, was designed to bring Native Americans into white culture. It was also, once they gave a small piece to each Native family, there'd be a lot of extra unallotted land, which they could then give to white settlers. So they could take much of the reservation back for white settlement as well. But that land that was given to Native families was given in a way that made it impossible for them to sell it. It made it impossible for them even to pass it through a will to a single child. It had to be broken up among the heirs. So what that meant was Native land in America, much of it, a lot of so-called allotted land, was fractionated to the point where very valuable fields were completely unusable because you would have not just hundreds, but now in many cases, thousands or tens of thousands of tiny fractional owners, where the cost of keeping track of those ownership shares dwarfed by orders of magnitude the value of the rents that were coming in. This was a tremendous destruction of not just native culture, but native wealth, as well as also both the native example tragedy and the African-American land loss. Those are both examples of ownership gridlock. Too many owners of a single farm, making it impossible to actually manage that farm in a productive way.
Yeah, I thought there are even more details in the book, and it's just fascinating because it's not an angle that a lot of people have, even those who are paid attention to what's happened to the wealth. And as you point out in the book, home ownership, land ownership is one of the greatest sources of not the richest families, but the middle class families of developing some kind of wealth over time for their families.
Yeah, the biggest wealth builder in American history turns out to be the 30-year mortgage. The amortizing 30-year mortgage, where at the end of that 30 years, you actually own the house outright. That is most people's retirement account, is their home. Who can afford it? Who can afford to buy into it?
And it has unintended consequences, like almost everybody likes inflation as a result.
Yeah, too low inflation is actually costly for a certain group of Americans. That's right.
Right. So, Jim, when we talk about the different 6 different things, we talked about attachment. So, what's your favorite example of this attachment idea, and how that should play out with a dimmer switch?
Yeah, so I'm an environmental guy. So my favorite example actually is groundwater. And so you would think that because of attachment, which basically says it's mine because it's attached to something, it's mine, that if you own the surface, right, this is your plot of land, then as the old Roman saying would go, you should own all the way from hell to heaven. Think of a searchlight, right, that goes up. And in fact, at the dawn of aviation, the age of aviation, actually landowners try to get airlines to be found guilty of trespassing, right? Because the plane would be flying over their property, and if you have that sort of absolutist view, that in fact is trespassing. The court said, no. You know, there's a certain ceiling of it, and it's not limited by the height of your ground-to-air missile, right? There's a limit to what you can control. But what about underneath your property, right? So imagine, for example, that you live in an area, say in Texas, and you've got a well, and the neighbor next to you has a well also, and that land is actually purchased by a bottled water company. And they bring in, instead of the hand pump, they bring in this big diesel pump, and they start pumping out all this water to put in bottles and sell elsewhere. We'll call it Ozarka water. And it turns out one day you go out and you drop your bucket in, and instead of a splash, you hear a thud, because your water now is below the level of your well. Can they do that, right? Is that theft? I mean, this was your water, and by them lowering the water table, they literally have sort of sucked your water over toward their property. And I mean, I assume your intuition is there's something wrong about that. Not in Texas. Right. In Texas, they rely on something called the rule of capture. And basically, if you can take it, it's yours. And if it screws your neighbor as a result, that's too bad. Now, this obviously has terrible consequences, because it basically gives everyone the incentive to use it as quickly as possible. Because if you don't take it, someone else will. That's the tragedy of the commons that Michael was referring to earlier. Most other states have something called sort of reasonable use. But let's go to California, where a lot of your members live. So in California, effectively, there was no regulation of groundwater, particularly in the ag sector along the Central Valley. The Central Valley actually has subsided. Central Valley, if you got a Central Valley in the 1920s, it would be about literally 40 feet higher than it is today, which is a remarkable statistic. We've pumped out the equivalent of 40 feet of water from the Central Valley, and as a result, the land is compacted. It's subsided. And that's basically stayed that way, right? There was actually no regulation until 2016. In the grips of the drought, people realized, you know, we got to do something about this. And so a law was passed called SGMA. I won't go into details, but it basically tries to say, let's think about ownership engineering. and how we can think of groundwater differently rather than this basically wild animal that's running around. Whoever gets it, they own it. Let's think about ways to work as a larger community. That to me is an example of a dimmer switch. All right. So in Texas, the idea is, well, either you own the water or your neighbor owns the water. And Texas basically says the on-off switch is whoever's got the water, it's theirs. Right. If it used to be on your property, too bad. That's not a smart way to think about this kind of resource. And the last thing I'll say before I turn over to Michael is that when resources are plentiful, we tend to think of ownership as an on-off switch because we can. There's enough to go around. The problem is that when plentiful resources become scarce, the rules that we use weren't designed for scarcity and they don't work well. Right. So the rule in Texas works fine if you're digging these wells, by hand and you've got a hand pump. They're terrible if you've got diesel pumps.
Have the countries along the Tigris and the Euphrates called you yet about trying to deal with this? Because they know they have a terrible issue going all up into Turkey and who uses the water on the way down.
Yeah, go ahead. Yeah.
Yeah, go ahead.
No, I was saying this is an age-old conflict, right? Yeah. I mean, think about the River Nile, right? One of the real flashpoints in the world right now is essentially between Ethiopia and Egypt. Ethiopia's built this big dam called the GERD, G-E-R-D dam. Egypt, for millennia has controlled the flow of the Nile. Not anymore. And countries don't like to give up that kind of power.
On a very small and technological scale, you told a great story about a drone getting shot out of the sky. You want to tell that story? I thought that was hilarious.
So this is the opposite. So, one version of what's attached to my land, the deed to your home is just a sheet of paper. It's flat. So anything else that you own, besides the surface, up or down, is a choice. And it's a choice that changes over history. Like it used to be the case that people could hunt across your land. They didn't have to ask your permission. Like it wasn't trespassing. They were free to cross your land and take wild animals off of it. It was a choice, after barbed wire, to shift towards having an exclusion understanding. The no trespassing version of ownership in America is a very modern version.
There was an older one, which was when the kings did it, because the whole story of Robin Hood is dependent upon the kings, and you can't take our deer.
Absolutely. Yeah. So there was there was the so-called royal prerogative in England that never did really translate it to America.
I just thought I'd throw Errol Flynn in here.
You got to always we always face an uphill battle as people who care about like who owns what and why. It's like the most important stuff. It's like what you get in the world, but people have a hard time focusing on it. Anyway, so movie references are always good. But so anyway, so Jim talked down, like who owns the water or oil or fracking. But then it's the same problem going up. Jim talked about the limit on what's attached, which is airplanes. You can't shoot those down. But the new technology is drones. So can a drone fly over your house? And that question, like any new technology, is absolutely up for grabs. So there was a case in Kentucky, actually, the aptly named Bullitt County, where a guy named William Meredith basically shot down a gun. It's a suburb. It wasn't like out in the country. This is a suburban backyard. Saw a drone fly over his house, took out a shotgun and blasted it out of the sky. He was arrested. He was super puzzled by being arrested. He said it was only number 3 bird shot. That's not going to hurt anybody. If I had shot like a 30 caliber, I can imagine. So his concern was that the ammo he was using was not problematic. But for many of us, shooting drones out of the sky, blasting drones out of the sky in a suburban neighborhood is kind of worrying. And his argument was that it was attached to his home. The land above was attached to his home. He said it's just like somebody climbing over the fence. And you can understand the privacy concerns. But this is very much up for grabs. And the reason that this issue hasn't been settled sort of just automatically in favor of someone like the landowner is that on this particular ownership conflict, there's a countervailing and extremely powerful set of interests that also have their own ownership story, which is Amazon, Domino's Pizza, UPS. They're all trying to think about how do they do delivery drones. So the droneways, the area above your house for delivering packages turns out to be extremely valuable space, a resource, not just to have you be shielded from cameras in the sky, but also for companies that are trying to think about what is the future of delivery going to be in a post-carbon world where it's all electric. We're not using delivery trucks for that, and that's actually very much an open question, as it should be. There's no natural or correct answer to how much should be attached to land, and we're fighting it out.
It's interesting because the old version of that story is that people worried about whether the mailman was the father. In this case, it's going to be whether the drone is taking pictures as it goes by when it's doing its delivery stuff. So it's the 21st century version of probably something extremely old. George, there are other attachment issues that are fascinating too, which are that have to do with like surrogate mothers. And I understand all the other issues involved, but it was interesting to deal with it as a property issue. So.
Well, attachment is the most important ownership story that your listeners have never heard of. Like they know about first come, first serve. They know what it means to line up. And you know what possession is 9/10 of the law means. You know what my body and myself means. But attachment is omnipresent. It's how if we're going to solve climate change, we're going to do it using attachment stories. If we're going to understand about how to do drone deliveries or not, whatever, all of those battles or fracking natural resource battles, those are all attachment stories. And one of the, for example, wind and solar as well. Those are attachment stories. Like, are those resources?
The solar, not the solar, but the wind turbines, of course, ruin things downstream for them. And so,
yeah. So how does that work?
Places just like the oil thing everyone's sucking the water out or the oil out.
Wind is super cool. People don't realize how cool wind is and the ownership conflicts that come up there. So you asked, just sort of switching gears away from that.
I'm sorry. I went to another digression already.
Yeah. So, but there's so much there. But there's a new, part of what's new about self-ownership is this notion of surrogacy, where a couple an infertile couple usually, or a same-sex couple that wants to have a third, a woman carry their embryo to term. Mm-hmm. And that, the old traditional version of that was actually the first story in the Bible, with Hagar being the surrogate for Abraham and Sarah, when Ishmael is born. But that version of surrogacy isn't really practiced so much today. But there is with new IVF technology.
I'm sorry, I like the way you guys mentioned that the problems caused by that surrogacy have not yet been solved.
No, that's right. It's Ishmael versus Isaac.
Just to show you what we're getting into with this problem.
Yeah, it's the great Abrahamic tradition, sort of still in conflict in some ways. So, but today what we have is the possibility of gestational surrogacy with IVF, where you have a genetically unrelated embryo to the woman who carries it. And it's only in the last couple of decades that it's been possible for this technology to create the ownership battles that raise the question: should it be possible to pay a woman to basically rent her womb for 9 months? Most women who are surrogates, who do get paid, mostly do it for altruistic reasons. And it's also a way to avoid, it's also a way to get paid for the medical risk and for the labor of laboring and carrying a child to term. And it's also very complicated morally and ethically to think about, because you have multiple adults creating a child. Mm-hmm. So managing the managing that in a dignified and humane way is not easy. And it comes down to how we structure ownership around surrogacy. So what is how do you protect the woman who is a surrogate? How do you protect the baby? And how do you protect the rights and interests of the intended parents? So that's an area where it's not surprising that people's intuitions will lead them to sort of an on-off switch thinking. But it's an area where the dimmer switch has actually been extremely helpful to create modern ownership around surrogacy that allows people to who want to be surrogates to do so in a safe way. So, for example, until a month ago, it was illegal to be a gestational surrogate in New York. Mm-hmm. New York families that wanted to have a gestational surrogate had to cross the river to New Jersey. Mm-hmm. It's still the case that in Illinois, it's okay, but you cross over to Michigan and it's illegal. So we have this sort of on-off switch approach. But we're beginning to see more sort of fine-grained turning of the dimmer to basically figure out how do you protect each of the parties in a way that makes this a humane and legal and actually quite beautiful way to use our bodies to create families for people who couldn't otherwise have them.
Yeah, and it's not talked about as much, but there's another element to it for the sperm donors, which is, you sign away your rights to everything like that, but that's the first legal thing as part of the contract. Now, does that contract get held up? There was a contestant on one of the singing shows the other day who clearly was not. Maybe she was chosen more for this than for the singing, which was that she had 50 or so half siblings because her father was a sperm donor, and she had parents, same-sex parents. And so she was now 20 years old. She had all these different siblings, and the father somehow was notified. They all the half siblings got together, probably using 23andMe, and then contact him, and they all had a party together. So he got to meet 40, 50 of his kids, which he just was a college donor. And that's another thing. Now, he didn't look like he was pushing any property rights there, and obviously the contract probably helped him to not have paternity payment rights, but all those things are up for grabs, like you said. This could all be turned upside down by either someone hostile to the whole idea. You could use it as a strategy to destroy it, as you've mentioned a couple other examples, or push in the other direction, something that they want to encourage and make it, some payments for all that.
Most of
the kids go to college.
Most of us aren't like hiring surrogates or shooting down drones, but that doesn't mean we aren't engaged in ownership issues all day long, every day. Like when you get in line for your latte in the morning and someone cuts around you with the app, that's an ownership issue. When you're sharing your HBO password with a friend, it's actually theft. That's an ownership issue. HBO wants you to do it, but so these ownership issues come up all day long in the most mundane parts of our daily lives.
I thought it was great that you explained why HBO wants you to steal. They probably ought not to disseminate that information.
Isn't that nuts? Isn't that nuts?
Make you an addict, basically.
Yeah. So this is actually one of the
toys that the toys are given away in the McDonald's, right?
So this is one of the most advanced strategies of ownership design. Is something that Jim and I call tolerated theft. And when we ask our students, like how many, ours are law students, how many of you illegally are using somebody else's password for HBO or Netflix? Mm-hmm. They all say yes, law students. And it turns out that it's actually a crime. You can go to jail for it. But HBO...
And lose your license, right?
And lose your license. But and HBO could find out who you are, and they absolutely don't. And just the opposite. They actually want you stealing their content. That's all they have to sell. But they have discovered that tolerated theft is a very valuable strategy for customer acquisition. Jim and I had an article in the Harvard Business Review last week, where we wrote about exactly this argument, the sort of advanced strategies of ownership engineering that very savvy companies like HBO and Netflix use. Actually, Netflix over the weekend just started cracking down on password sharing. I hope they didn't read our HBR article. It's a sort of Heisenberg uncertainty principle of like social theory, which is you write about it and you change it. But it is interesting. They're doing it very tentatively because the music industry, when it shut down Napster a generation ago, really pissed off a generation of young people who became more committed to pirating. So HBO, I think, has a better strategy here, which is as young people sort of share passwords, it builds buzz for the shows. It builds, as you said, and as the president of HBO said, it builds video addicts, which is very valuable to HBO.
Well, it's interesting in this pandemic year where people have had a lot more time to watch. You mentioned how the pirates will always, get better at what they're doing too. You could imagine someone saying, "Well, now I have this year, and I have this password, so for free, I'm going to watch as much HBO content as possible, and I'll never have to watch HBO again because I'll have watched everything." You don't become an addict. You've sucked it dry.
Yeah, but I mean that's the beauty of HBO is that they keep coming with new things. I mean, so for instance, while you're watching a reality show with the step siblings, I was watching WandaVision, right? I mean, there are always new series that are coming along, and the idea is we're going to hook you on being an HBO loyal consumer, and as you get wealthier in time, the idea is this isn't entirely kosher, and the hope is in time you'll actually get a password of your own.
And feel that you owe them. You feel obligated, right? So I don't think this was in your book, but what about the whole split of the who owns what on the content right now? Because it used to be that they had all these contracts with the cable TV companies, but now that live streaming is available, everybody wants to grab their content back and own it, and then live stream it to, like Disney Plus now and so on and so forth. So that you can dump your cable and have 2 or 3 of these services, and that's it. And
well, I don't know if that's your experience. What I'm discovering is that I still have my cable, and I have 7 or 8 of these services. I'm actually paying more bills than I ever did, and that's actually a trend. Part of what's interesting in the media space is I have these sort of generational transitions. Right. For how media is delivered. You had, when I was growing up, there was the test pattern in the middle of the night. I remember the test pattern, and then you had a handful of stations, and that went away. And now we have this sort of explosion of streaming services. And pretty soon, I'm going to get impatient with paying 7 or 8 bills, and there will be some reconsolidation back down to a manageable number. But what's interesting about that from an ownership perspective, about the people grabbing their content back, is that it's another example of gridlock, which is that you have multiple rights holders on any show. The third bassoonist in the orchestra that plays in the background needs to be reapproached if you're going to have the show reemerge from the vault of MGM and put back on the air on any of these services. Actually, licensing, that's called clearing rights in the trade, is actually quite complicated. And a lot of the content that I grew up with and you grew up with is still locked away because they haven't been able to clear the rights.
Well, you talk about it briefly, but why don't you explain ASCAP and how they solved this problem for these tiny little micro things before they had computers to do it all?
Sure. So in the radio play area, so you're a little radio station in Des Moines. You play a bunch of songs. How do you pay those songwriters for using their copyrights, both the performance copyright and the music copyright? How do you actually make that payment? It turns out to be really hard to do. If you had to negotiate with every songwriter for every song you wanted to play, you'd hear "Let It Be" 1,000 times and nothing else, because you could negotiate with them and be done. Right. Although actually the Beatles
should be okay.
Should be okay, but actually it's a bad example because the Beatles are actually particularly complicated to negotiate around. So what ASCAP and BMI do, right? we have is something called copyright clearinghouses. And what they do is radio stations, Spotify, Pandora, the bar that you go and listen to music in, karaoke bars, they basically put a list at the end of the year of all the songs that they've played. They send it into a clearinghouse, and they get sent a bill for the flat rate per song. Mm-hmm. Billions come in, and then those clearinghouses send a check. Your song got played 800,000 times, and here's a check for what, the amount that you get for that. So the clearinghouses basically are a space in between the people who are the creators and the people who are the listeners. And instead of having them negotiate and basically have gridlock, have the inability to negotiate, what we have in America is your ownership of the copyright turns into a fixed mandatory licensing fee for radio play. So there's no negotiation, and a zero negotiation world turns out to be a one that's actually much more, makes culture much more available. That's actually the solution that would be the right solution for something we talked about earlier with Henrietta Lacks and Moore, the guy with the spleen that was taken out and tortured for years by those UCLA doctors. The solution there would be a mandatory licensing scheme, just like we use for radio play. That would basically say, we're not going to block science. We're not going to tie scientists up in negotiation, but we're going to give a small mandatory amount to people who actually provide the human material from their bodies that becomes the next polio vaccine, which is what came from Henrietta Skloot's body. So it's possible to actually solve those conflicts using really innovative ownership design.
Well, I'd like to talk directly to the audience. If you have any questions for Jim or for Michael, you can send them in. We have about 10 minutes left, maybe 5. And the other element of the book that I wanted to talk about, besides, you have all these good examples, is I've always found it fascinating. People have no idea what's really going on in the world unless they read the business section about the same things that they like, because there's all these business deals that make everything run. And people are often totally unaware of them. And it makes it, you have all kinds of examples of what was really going on. What was the theory? What was the practice going on behind it? And why we ended up with what we've ended up with in terms of our cultural society. And I had a more personal question for you, Jim. You're a split between environmental law and working at the law school in property. What came first, and how did you decide for a split like that? That's a very interesting combination.
Yeah, so I'm a tree hugger. So that always came first. I worked for the Fish and Wildlife Service before I went to law school. And really, I didn't think much about property. Certainly when I took property in law school, no one mentioned the environment. And essentially sort of what I've seen as property environmental protection has advanced over the last 2-3 decades is environmentalists have realized property rights really matter. And if you want to solve these problems, you better focus on ownership and not simply regulating thou shalt and thou shalt not. And so that's really, I mean, that's where in my view, that's where the cutting edge environmental policy is right now.
Yeah, I was going to say that to me, when thinking about politics more than just the property part of it, what incentives you set up is really what you're going to end up with 30 years later. And then being clever about your incentives is actually the crucial thing for making democracy work in the future. And it was absolutely crucial for making America work in the beginning, the incentives that were built into the system in the blocks and passages. So, Michael, how did the two of you start working together on this? Because, people...
we both of us love to co-author, and we had Jim had written a great book, which actually your listeners should look up. It's called "Drinking Water: A History," about the history of drinking water in America. Literally, quite the title is well named, and so it's a great read. And he was looking around to do a new popular book, a book that basically is meant for people to pick up on an airplane or read on the beach or give to their family members and I had done the same thing. I had written a book called The Gridlock Economy. That was talking about some of these ownership gridlock issues. And I was also in the sort of trying to think like, what's the next thing I want to write? Both Jim and I have been teaching for decades, and we've taught, thousands and thousands of students. And we realized, both of us, that part of the sort of privilege that we have as professors is to be able to think about how do we speak very plainly and simply? How do we reach an audience beyond just the people who are the people that we're teaching in our classes? We've both written so many academic articles, and we wanted to have a way to reach beyond that. We were friends from the environmental talk circuit, I guess, early on. Mm-hmm. And Jim actually approached me. He was like, a friend of his that suggested to him, maybe it's time to have a book like Freakonomics. Freakonomics is about how incentives steer us around. Books like Predictably Irrational and Nudge are about how cognitive biases steer us around. But neither the economics nor the psychology books take seriously how ownership really works. They sort of take ownership as a sort of on-off switch. Mm-hmm. And we thought, there should be a book that's fun and surprising and counterintuitive and infuriating, with the same kinds of stories that are going to help people see how the world around them really works, how ownership works like a remote control, how businesses and governments are steering you all day long in every part of your life in order to do what they want, using this very few handful of ownership stories. So once Jim came to me with that as a let's think about doing that, it was like, oh my God, of course, like this is how I want to spend the next few years. And we've spent and that's been over 5 years now, basically auditioning stories. Mm-hmm. Like stories come in and they're like, I want to be in your book. Like, I'm a cool story. I'm fun. And it's like, no, you're not like counterintuitive enough or infuriating enough or fun enough. So the stories that are left, the ones that we actually have in the book, are ones that we feel like, everyone can relate to. This is like something that happens all around us every day. And the what has been like writing together has been trading drafts back and forth and being on Zoom calls really for years now, basically fighting about, sort of enjoying, is this a really fun story? And then taking turns writing it back and forth. It's a super fun way to be a professor, is to both sort of have the ability to work together in this very close way and to work together over something where it's like, we're both really passionate about this stuff. I don't know if it comes across. I hope it does in this talk. We love this stuff.
Absolutely. And I again, what you said about the stories is absolutely true. And that the John Moore story is so infuriating, but at the same time, you can get to the law and say, but how else is the law going to deal with this? And you make great examples. But the story, just imagining this guy thinking he's being treated and having the doctor at UCLA. You didn't get in any trouble writing that about a doctor from UCLA, did you?
Yeah.
Where you work, yeah. And what's also interesting, I think, to non-lawyers, I mean, a lot of people think lawyers are just, so process-oriented and rules and stuff like, is it? If you just say about the environment, all right, everybody stop polluting, nothing happens, If you say, I think, for example, when we think, the big moral issues of humanity and culture, people have given us really big issues of how to do something. If you're all just better, we can change this. But actually, if you put the right incentive in place, it changes. And it hasn't changed for thousands of years, being exhorted to change things. And just like the idea of poverty, that we should do something about poverty. Well, 5,000 years ago, if someone had said, what we could use is like not really out and out greed, but just a kind of dimmed down version of greed, then we probably would have been out of this long, long ago. That we would have been out of the poverty long ago, because we just used it in India and China, and a couple 100 million people in 30 years moved out of poverty. And of course, it needs to be fine tuned. But those incentives make such a big difference. So let's take what each of you pick. What's your favorite incentive that you think isn't in place that you think would change things? Go ahead, Michael.
Yeah, go, Michael. Go ahead.
Yeah.
Well, I think the most important piece that I've learned in writing this book is the framing that we have, which is that there are just this very, very small number of stories. And usually if you're in some ownership conflict, or you see some ownership dilemma, you see, why on earth are people polluting? Why are the lines this long? What's going on here? There's usually a very simple ownership story behind it. Now, when and a lot of our readers, but probably what's been fun about talking about this book out to various audiences is when we hear back from readers, they say, "Oh my God, I just understood." Like I was just talking to one of an interviewer earlier today who's like, "I just understand why people draw chalk lines on the 4th of July parade route in this town in Iowa where this interview was. I get it. They're trying to save the space, and it's the language of possession." Things just snap into focus in your life when you see there's just this very small handful of stories. So that's really the biggest contribution that I want people to see. You open the newspaper today, there's going to be a bunch of headlines. You walk down the street today, there's going to be a bunch of instances in your daily life that all turn on just these very few rules of ownership. And once you see them, you can actually begin to do something about them. So that's the piece I think that's for me most exciting, is the notion that this is really very much more under our control as parents, as a parent, as a consumer, and for some of these issues as a citizen, to really take back control of the remote control of ownership in your life.
Yeah, I reinforce that.
So many great stories about the people, how they save spaces and don't save spaces, and what works in one city and doesn't work in another city. But I'll let the people read that. Go ahead, Jim.
Yeah, that's chapter 2. I mean, I sort of reinforce what Michael said. I mean, I don't know how many of you have seen The Matrix. This is a wonderful scene when Neo kind of leans back, and all of a sudden everything turns to ones and zeros, and he just sort of sees how it all fits together. And as Michael said, if you start looking for ownership, things just make a lot of sense all of a sudden. And so, I mean, what I would sort of say is I'd reinforce what Michael said, and I'd amplify that by saying also ownership is up for grabs. It's always up for grabs. There is no natural correct answer for who gets what. In realizing it's up for grabs, that allows you to start to change things or to see how things can be changed. Do not take things as given, right? If you look for ownership, you'll see where the rule lies, which story is dominant. But I promise you, there's always another of those 6 ownership stories that are also valid.
Now that's something that I changed the 7th commandment 30, 40 years ago, where it says, "Thou shalt not steal." And I said, "Thou shalt steal, because this will keep you all impoverished forever." And that's the way I meant you to be. And what you're basically saying is that if you see the incentives and you see what we're doing and you say it's up for grabs, we can cooperate, figure out a way to do this, figure out a way to put incentives in place. Just like parenting you were talking about. I mean, it's like good parenting. You bring out the best in the children. You can't change the children, but you can bring out the best with good incentives, and you can bring out the worst with bad incentives. So thank you very much, both of you gentlemen. That was really a lot of fun, which is very rare about legal topics.
It was really fun to be with you guys tonight. This is so much fun. Thank you.
Good. So ends another event in the Commonwealth Club's 119 years of enlightened discussion. Thank you again, Michael and Jim, for joining us.
Thank you.